Hey students, I'm going to read to you this story called The Lifeguard by Mary Morris, and then you'll answer some questions about it afterwards. The summer before I left for college, I was head lifeguard on the beach at Pirates Point. I don't think real pirates ever landed there, but the name made me think that strange and mysterious things could happen right where I lived. I grew up on that peninsula, and it was my home. I never found it monotonous, staring across the sea, but instead I like to think of what lay beyond. How someday, perhaps, I'll sail to the other side. The beach was a long strip of what had once been white sand, but was now beginning to turn darker and less pristine. It was lined with striped umbrellas and beach chairs. I loved the gentle easing of the beach umbrellas into the sand, the smell of copper tone on my skin, the way people looked up when I blew my whistle, their faces always with a slight look of terror that one of theirs had been swept up ever since the drowning of Billy Mandel. For 4 years of my youth, I was a lifeguard there. I'd watched this beach where I'd spent my summers as a boy, a red bucket and shovel in hand, filled with more and more umbrellas. I had watched the boys who were lifeguards turn flabby. I had seen Rick Spencer, who ruled this beach before me for half a decade, lose his hair. And I'd seen the slim bodies of women stretch with childbearing. I'd seen it all, and it had not impressed me, but rather it flowed through me like a river, not stopping here. I was 18 then. I wore zinc oxide on my nose, a whistle around my neck, number 4 copper tone covered my body. I could lift a girl into the air with each arm, and I loved to walk by the beach, a girl dangling from each bicep. Girls clung to my stand, like the shipwreck to their raft. And I could do no wrong. It would have been a perfect summer for me were it not for Mrs. Lovenheim. Every day at the same time, about 10 in the morning, Mrs. Lovenheim came. She never had to ask me to set up her red and white umbrella because she always came at the same time each day, so I was ready for her. Mrs. Lovenheim stretched out like a cat, opened a book which she held open at almost the same page every day, and stayed like that for hours, then went away. She never went near the water or sat in the sun. She never walked to the hot dog stand, but instead just stayed beneath her umbrella, straw hat on her head. That was all she did, except it seemed as though Mrs. Lovenheim never took her eyes off me. She was perhaps only 30 then, but she seemed very old. She had flaming red hair and a small, compact body. She'd been married to a real estate broker who dropped her, my mother told me, after she'd miscarried 2 babies. She could not hold them, my mother whispered to me one evening in the darkened corner of my den, where my own father had drunk beer and watched TV sports until he died suddenly during a winter storm. And this secret world of women seemed ever closed to me. I did not care for such things, for women who could and could not hold babies, for women who had been left in the middle of their lives alone. I had girls who loved me, the girls of summer, with their bronzed skin and naked, unblemished bellies. It would have been a perfect summer for me, in this last summer of my youth, if I had not felt that at each moment my every move was being watched by Mrs. Lovenheim, who never spoke, unless she wanted something or rose until it was time to go home. If I had not felt that, while my eyes were on the water, Mrs. Lovenheim's were on me. Rick Spencer came on weekends with his wife, Sally, and their daughter, Becky. Sally used to babysit for me when I was a boy. She'd make big vats of hot chocolate, which we'd sip in front of late movies. She liked the really scary movies in which giant pods swallowed people or something came out of the muck, terrorizing a neighborhood, and Sally clutched my hand whenever the frightening thing appeared, making me feel, even though she was taking care of me, as if I were the one who was taking care of her. Then she married Rick Spencer, and some say she had to. Becky was born not long after their marriage, and Sally's days in bikinis were gone. On weekdays, Sally and her mother, Mrs. Winston, who used to be our neighbor, came alone to the beach. But on the weekend, Rick came as well, and I could see him lying listlessly on the sand, bored within the confines of his family, and when he could get away from them, he'd plant himself beneath my stand. He'd been on duty then when the Mandel boy disappeared, and it was a story he liked to tell. The drowning of Billy Mandel was the only recorded drowning in the history of Pirates Point, and the first time Rick told me about the Mandel boy, it was like a warning to me. Not that the drowning had been Rick's fault, but then over many Saturdays beneath my stand, the story grew and improved. "It was like this," Rick said, beads of sweat shimmering on the place where his hair used to be. In his glory, Rick had a taut swimmer's body and thick blonde curls. "It was this quick thing." A split second, when a child was playing with a bucket by the shore and the father looks up, distracted by the call of a friend, Rick would make up dialogue for me. Hey, Joe, how you doing? How about that dinner with us next Saturday?" Or, "I see the wife's got you working." Innocuous words like that, and when the father looked back, when he let his gaze turn to the place where the sea met the shore, where Billy had been digging just moments before, there was a blank space. A void where he'd been taken by a wave, not a very big wave, but big enough to pull him under. While my own eyes scanned the water, Rick loved to describe the search of the beach, the lifeguard's patrol. He would describe himself swimming endlessly along the shoreline until the sea brought Billy Mandel back hours later, bloated and having strangely taken on the color of the sea. That summer the girls would not stay away, and I'd have to hold them at bay. They'd offer to buy me things, Cokes, hot dogs, and rub cream on my back while I sat like an idol perched in my chair. I liked being above them because I could see down the front of their bathing suits, and even though they knew I was looking at their breasts, they did nothing to hide. There was Cindy Hartwick with her thick black hair, who I dated sometimes on Saturday nights when my mom gave me a car. Sarah Clarkson, who would be beautiful as soon as her braces came off. There was Peggy Mandel, and sometimes I'd look across the beach and see Mr. and Mrs. Mandel with their daughter, a girl, almost my age now. Their only child, Peggy, who was a sophomore and known to be fast, used to shout at her parents, who sat motionless reading endless newspapers unless Peggy went for a swim. And then Mr. Mandel would stand in his sneakers, waves lapping at his feet, as if somehow through his attentiveness he could bring back what was gone. I was above them all from my stand, where my eyes scanned the beach like a beacon. I could see the Spencers under their blue and yellow umbrella, and I could watch Becky go toddling away when Rick was there. Becky went naked and got to eat, but then it was just the women. Becky stayed undressed. And there was Mrs. Potter, who'd had a heart attack and walked with small weights in his hands and up and down. Mr. Potter, up and down the shoreline, and there was Mrs. Lovenheim, always there watching my every move whenever the girls came around. My dreams at night were like the dreams of other boys. I dreamed of the bodies of girls, dreams that woke me from my sleep, leaving me sweaty, sheets twisted around me, dreams that made me rise in the middle of the night and throw the window open until my mother, who never slept well in the big bed after my father died, she shouted, "Are you all right? Is anything wrong?" Those were most of my dreams, but there were others. Dreams of water. Sometimes there was a nightmare that came to me. In it, I see myself from a perspective that is high. I'm a boy with a bucket in my hand, playing in the setting of parents, umbrellas, buckets, and shovels, and then from behind me, always behind me, as I dig a hole in the sand, the sea is rising, black, surging against the sky. All summer long, when he could sneak away, Rick Spencer came and sat at the base of my lifeguard stand, talked about the good old days. Rick had been my teacher for Red Cross training. He taught me what I know about riptides and undertows and sudden changes on the surface of the sea. He was only 26 that summer when I became head lifeguard. But he used to say, as bronze girls handed me Cokes or asked if I needed more oil in my back, "Man, you don't know what it is. You don't know what you got." He'd always say it in the same way. So finally one day I said to him, "What is it, Rick? What have I got?" He extended his arms as if to encompass the beach. "You've got all this. It's yours." I laughed, not understanding what he meant. "You know," he went on, "I've got this job. I sell computer parts. I go to those retail stores all over New England, even in the winter when it's freezing cold. And I think to myself, how I wish I were anywhere else, doing anything else. But what can I do?" He pointed over to Mrs. Lovenheim, who was looking our way, her novel lying flat on her blanket. "You know, I knew her before she married that guy who dumped her." I looked over at Mrs. Lovenheim, and she did not look away. I couldn't imagine that anyone could have known her whenever that was. "She was something," Rick said. He whistled between his teeth. Just then, Cindy Hartwick appeared with a hot dog for me with everything on it. one I hadn't even asked for, and she handed it up. Then Peggy Mandel strutted up by in a bikini to her father's dismay. I tipped my visor. Then Rick went on. "You don't know," he said, "how lucky you are." I loved my body that summer. I loved its firmness, its bronze skin, but mostly I loved the way I was admired. Girls I didn't know would come up and squeeze parts of me. Old people looked at me, their bodies covered with chicken skin and blue veins, as if I were an object in the museum that had become their lives. So I loved to stroll the beach among the girls who wanted to have me, old men who wanted to be me. Sitting in my chair was harder because the thing about being a lifeguard is that your eyes should be set on the sea. You watch for nothing, really, and sometimes you begin to see things. I've seen what I thought were tidal waves of my dreams heading straight for me, but it was only the meeting of a cloud and the sea. I've seen monsters rise from the belly of sleep when it's only a big fish leaping in the air. I've seen things that aren't there at all. I've seen people before my eyes disappear. Sometimes I've heard cries for help from behind the waves, but these are all lifeguard mirages. They happen to anyone who looks at one thing too long. But sometimes it was hard for me to keep looking out, and so I welcomed the company of girls, though I'd never intended to do this. One day I asked out Peggy Mandel. She had come to hand me a Coke, and I gazed down at her, and then I said, quite simply, "Would you like to go to a movie Saturday night?" On Saturday night, I picked up Peggy. She wore a pink cotton dress with spaghetti straps. Her parents stood at the door, despondent, as if I were taking her to live in another country, saying useless things like, "Come back soon." I watched them curiously, these people whose life had been irrevocably altered with the sweep of a wave. We went to a drive-in where I let my arm dangle against the seat. She leaned her head into my arm, and I felt her breath against my chest. I pulled her closer to me. She raised her head toward me, bringing her lips to my lips. She was warm and alive, and I knew I could have almost anything I wanted with her. I leaned my face close to hers. "Tell me about Billy," I heard myself say. She pulled away slightly at first. "What?" she said. She was flushed and drowsy, like someone who has been asleep. About Billy, I want to know." She sat back, tossing her brown hair. "Billy?" "Your brother, the one who drowned," as if she didn't know. "Tell me about it." Her face looked the way I've seen girls look amazed and sickened in biology labs when a rodent was about to be splayed. "You want to know about Billy? Why do you want to know about Billy? Why do you want to know about Billy?" "I don't know, just tell me what happened." I couldn't explain why, but I wanted to know what it is like when you look at the patch of sand and a part of your life is gone. What does she imagine it felt like to be deep in the sea? Maybe it was because Rick Spencer had talked about it so much, but I wanted her to tell me what no one else could. What happened? "You want to know what happened?" I realized the thought of my request was odd. "I'm the lifeguard," I said. "I don't want to make any mistakes." "Okay, I'll tell you what happened." She was furious now and looked old for her years. "My dad looked away, and Billy drowned, and no one's ever seen him or been the same. Is that what you want to know?" I wanted to know what it was like. "Did you play with him when he was small?" "I was 4 years old, and my brother drowned." She flung her body to the opposite side of the car, so the door made a jangling sound, as if someone were trying to get in. "You're sick," she said under her breath. "Now take me home." The day it happened was a day of particular calm, a Saturday when a gentle southwest wind blew, a day when the waves hardly lapped, and it was almost hypnotic for me and my eyes fixed on the sea. It was easier to look at roughness and fast-breaking waves, and that day I was having trouble staying awake. Rick Spencer stood beneath my lifeguard stand that morning. He stood there and said, "You know what, man, I've been thinking I could do something else with my life. I mean, I could go to night school, maybe become a coach. I don't have to do this door-to-door crap." "Hey," I told him, "there's plenty you could do." "That's just what I've been thinking. I've been thinking about opening a little retail store, maybe software. What do you think?" He seemed happy just having said this when Cindy Hartwick came by with a Coke. Rick Wink drifted away. "Catch you later," he said, heading back to his umbrella. "Hey," Cindy said, "what are you doing after work?" I gazed down for a moment. Cindy wore a turquoise two-piece, and she had straight black hair, black eyes. She began climbing up my stand like a monkey, laughing. "Hey, so what are you doing?" Then Peggy Mandel walked by. "He's a sicko," she shouted. "He's weird." "Not as weird as you, Mandel," I called back. "Not like you." "Oh, yeah? Go to a drive-in with him. You'll see." "What's she talking about?" Cindy asked. "Oh, it's nothing," I said. But Peggy had disturbed me. Now Cindy was reaching up, and I thought I'd take her out Saturday night. I didn't have to look. I could feel Mrs. Lovenheim's eyes on me. Cindy kept reaching for me as if I thought it would drive Mrs. Lovenheim wild. I pretended to pull Cindy up to my stand. It was perhaps only an instant that I was distracted, but suddenly I was aware of the shouting, and it took me by surprise. At first, I thought I was hearing things, but it was too loud and clear. Perhaps I had my eyes off the sea for 1 minute, maybe 2. No more than that. Perhaps for the first time that summer, I'd completely forgotten where I was. Now my instincts took over. I let go of Cindy, stood up straight in my chair, grabbing my binoculars. I scanned the water for signs of the flailing arms, a bobbing head, the gathering of crowds, parents diving. But there was nothing at all. But still I heard the shouting, so I leapt to the sand, began to race up and down the shore. That was when I saw Rick Spencer running across the burning sand, waving his hands in an awkward way. He ran forward, then back, then forward again, like a dog wanting to play catch. He kept waving, shouting, then rushing back again. And Mr. Potter, whose own failing heart kept him pacing the shore, he came puffing to me. "A child," he said with surprising composure. "Over there," pointing to the Spencer umbrella. I was amazed by this, taken off guard. While I had been searching ahead, what had happened was behind me. A crowd had gathered around the blue and yellow umbrella. The Mandels put the newspaper down and started walking, Mrs. Mandel clinging to her husband's arm. I saw a small frenzy of people moving up and down. I ran towards Rick. He caught me in his arms. "It's Becky!" He took me like a wet towel, shook me. "Get your kit! Get your damn kit!" I dashed back to my stand, grabbed my first aid kit, raced, my own feet searing on the sand. I made my way through where the crowd had gathered. I saw Becky Spencer, her face puffed, her mouth open, but no sound coming, her eyes in a fixed stare, turning as blue as the sea. I'd set my sights on, and I knew this was the color of Billy Mandel when he'd been tossed back to the shore. "She swallowed something," Rick said. He shook violently. "Do something, man!" Tears fell down his cheeks. "I've tried everything. God, please do something." "You've killed her," Mrs. Winston on her knees shouted. "You've killed your daughter." Sally, tears streaming down her face, kept banging her daughter on the back. "Turn her over," I said, and I tipped Becky upside down, pounding at her back, but no breath came from her, no sound. I tipped her again, like an hourglass, but still nothing came. Then I clutched the dying child in my arms. "You've killed her," Mrs. Winston shrieked, pointing at Rick. "You'll live with this forever." Sally Spencer, who'd once dug her nails into my arm during the horror movies of my youth, now did so again. "You're the lifeguard," she said matter-of-factly. "You're supposed to know what to do." But I'd done everything I've been trained to do, and nothing could bring Becky Spencer, her mouth gaping in a silent, breathless hole, back to life. It was then I saw Mrs. Lovenheim close her book, take off her hat, and rise, and I saw that woman, left and bereft, who had languished all summer beneath her umbrella, coming toward us, her red hair wild in the breeze, and like Moses she parted the spectators, the advisors, the lookers-on. She pushed the screaming mother away, shoved the accusatory grandmother onto the hot sand. She thrust Rick into the background and plucked the dying child from my arms, forcing me to my knees. She held Becky, the child's face the shade of the deepest recesses of the sea, her body rigid and motionless. Then Mrs. Lovenheim wrapped her body around Becky's, folded the blue, breathless body into her own. I watched from my knees as the woman whose beach umbrella I had planted day after day, whose chairs I had arranged, who had tipped me poorly, whose face was beset by grief of her own failed marriage, who nursed what I now recognize to be a broken heart, Mrs. Lovenheim, perhaps not more than 30 then, she grappled the child into her arms, engulfed her as if bringing her back into her own womb, and then pressed someplace I had not found. She squeezed Becky above the navel 3 times with a force I'd never before seen in nature, until a perfect, unblemished green grape shot like a bullet from the child's mouth. Becky gasped and spit as Mrs. Lovenheim handed the whimpering child to her mother, who sobbed in the sand. For the first time, the grandmother was silent. Rick stood shaking, his life altered. Then Mrs. Lovenheim turned to me where I stood, first aid kit dangling in my hands like a lunch box. I felt as if I were about to say something or do, but instead, without a word, she moved past, back to her umbrella, collected her things, and left. That night, I could not sleep. It was late. I wasn't sure what was bothering me, so I went downstairs. I sat in my father's chair in the darkened den until I knew what I wanted to do. I found the address in the phone book, and then I got into the car and I drove. I drove along the ocean road until I was a block short of her house, and I parked there. It was a clear night at the end of August. The salt breeze blew off the ocean. It was a nice night for a walk along the shore, so I took my time, sucking in my breath, and then I headed down the street until I reached the house where she lived. The lights were on upstairs, but I stood for a long time on the porch. Then I knocked on the door, softly at first, and then at last she descended the upstairs, where she wore a yellow robe tied around her waist and her red hair fell on her shoulders. "Yes?" Mrs. Lovenheim said, her voice warm like a breeze. It's me," I said. "Josh Michaels." She slowly opened the door, only partially at first, and then she looked at me as if trying to remember when she'd seen me before. "I'm the lifeguard?" I said, not knowing what else to say, and it suddenly occurred to me that she had no idea who I was. She'd never really seen me at all, so I added foolishly, "At the beach?" "Yes," she mumbled. "What is it?" "I wanted to thank you," I said, not really knowing why I had come. "I wanted to thank you for what you did this afternoon." She cocked her head. "Oh, it's just something I learned. I take silly courses sometimes." "But I didn't know what to do," I mumbled. I was not aware, as I said that, tears streamed down my face. But soon I found myself crying on Mrs. Lovenheim's porch, on the porch of this woman who I was, in fact, nothing at all. I dropped my shoulders. I stood there sobbing. I didn't know what to do. I don't know how long I stood there like that before she reached for me, pulled me to her, wrapped me in her arms around mine, and she smelled of shampoo and oils, not the salt and sand I had expected. It was the first time I felt what it was supposed to feel like to be in the arms of a woman, not the girls whose breath steamed my car on Saturday nights. But it was not her body I felt, though I liked the feel of it. It was not her sex, though I was aware of it. Rather, I felt myself longing for something I could never have, and wanted her to take me back, fold me inside of herself as she'd folded Becky that afternoon. But then she let me go. I grabbed at her, trying to hold on, as if her arms could save me from what came next, but without a word, she went inside. "Wait," I said. "Come back." I knew I would never want anyone or anything as much as I wanted Mrs. Lovenheim right then, and I found myself slipping into despair as she released me back into the world. It was the last time I saw Mrs. Lovenheim that summer, or any other summer for that matter. Or perhaps I saw her again, but we no longer recognized each other. It was my last summer on the beach, and after that the winds shifted, the weather changed, which would bring my departure for college, and years have passed since that day on Pirates Point, and I'm old now, perhaps as old as Mrs. Lovenheim was then. I've never seen the water or the umbrellas of summer in the same way again.